Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Shaped by Grace. We're on episode 5 in our series on relationships. Today, we will be specifically talking about dating. So, buckle up, hold on to your seats, and enjoy the ride.
Okay, so last week we started talking about singleness in our 3-part series talking about relationships. We were able to have an episode with our good friend Jeremy Flores, and we're thankful for everybody that listened to that episode. If you haven't listened to it, you can go on Spotify or any other podcast app and find it. But this week we are going to discuss dating. So interestingly enough, the Bible doesn't have a whole lot to say about dating.
No, they didn't, because in Eastern culture, you were just matched up with somebody based on familial ties, or if your mom and dad had a lot of sheep and goats, or political means. So dating was not a thing.
Yeah.
It was foreign to them, much like arranged marriages are foreign to Western culture. And so let's start off with that culture of dating.
Yeah. So obviously, there's a lot of cultural issues as well as myths that go around dating. And honestly, some of it comes from the Christian church, which is a little sad. But like we said, the Bible isn't going into all these details about dating. Like, you can't open up the Bible and find dating 101. You find stuff about singleness and you find a lot about marriage, but dating specifically, it's a little more difficult. You kind of have to read between the lines, kind of thing. But before we get into the myths of dating and cultural issues, we want to start off by saying the purpose of dating is to get married.
Yep.
So you have to start there, first of all. And really, it needs to be a godly marriage. You need to have godly intentions for a godly marriage. And so, because dating has changed so much with our culture, it has strayed very, very far away from the intentions of marriage. And so the purpose of dating now is not what it should be or what it once was. So what is like one cultural issue that just pops into your head, Brennan, just right off the bat when it comes to dating?
Man, dating to know what you want. The idea of I need a date because I don't really know what I like or what I don't like. That's just not a good outlook to have when you begin to date, because it leads to a lot of hurt. It leads to a lot of hangups later on when you do find someone that loves Jesus. And so it's not a good place to start off. I know there's another one that I'd like to talk about. It's casual dating, or the prolonged dating that almost looks like a wannabe marriage type of thing. Oh, well, I've just been dating them so long. We're practically married. No, you're not. You're not practically anything. If you have to put practically in that sentence, then you're not.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, going off of what you said, there's this idea when you're a teenager that kind of gets a seed planted in your head that, well, you don't know what you want in a relationship, so you should date multiple people in order to figure that out. Like, you should never just date one person. But like you were saying, that leads to a lot of emotional issues. That leads to a lot of crossing lines as far as physical and emotional that shouldn't be crossed. And guess what? You bring all of those issues into marriage. So again, like, this idea that you have to be with multiple people in order to understand what you want is just not true.
Yeah, and it's true in other aspects as far as like sports. You know, the more experience you have in sports, the better you are at it. In dating, that's not so. And I think with this one, I don't want to get too far ahead of us ourselves, but um, if you know the intentions of what God has for marriage before you date, then you know what you want in a dating relationship. And
Exactly.
so it goes hand in hand with um, honoring God with every part of our life. That's what this whole podcast is about: is to learn how to live a holy life that's focused in on God. I think another myth that I think is very prevalent, especially when you talk with somebody who has just broken up with somebody, and you're like, well, they just weren't the one. And I'm like,
Yeah.
the one what? Is there only one person out of 7 billion people in this world that God wants you to marry?
Yeah. Like that idea is not found in scripture whatsoever. Um, like nowhere. It's absolutely nowhere. And it's very arrogant of ourselves to think God created this person specifically just for me.
I mean, there's songs dedicated to that idea, and I think it's so immersed in our culture and has sunken into the church that we don't even realize that that's the mindset that we have when we're dating. But I think that kind of pushes us into um, the idea of so what is dating if there's not the one for me, like what are the basic guidelines that scripture teaches us for dating. It's very simple actually.
Yeah. Basically, it can boil down to two things. They should be a believer, a Christian, and they should be of the opposite sex. And that's it. It's very simple. We make it a lot more complicated, and I think that's where this you have to date multiple people. There's the one for me, and this prolonged dating. Um, like that complicates dating, but because we've strayed away from those two simple principles, we think we have to add more to it. We think we have to make it more complicated
Yeah.
than it is, and like with the one for me, it's like we think that the person has to meet all of these needs, emotional needs. And so if they're not meeting them, I think that's where we get the prolonged dating because it's like, well, I don't know, they're not meeting my needs. So maybe we should just keep dating and they'll grow.
Yeah.
But like, God's just like, okay, are they a Christian and are they of the opposite sex?
But that mindset of will they grow out of it, comes from a mentality that you can fix people. Like, but if they're not already running towards Christ, then they're not going to get fixed. Like you're going to bring those
Exactly.
things into your marriage. And in prepping for this episode, we read this really cool article from Desiring God that I will share on our Instagram after this podcast comes out. But it had some pretty um, good things as far as how to date as a Christian. But I think at the foundation, you have to. There's no arguing these 2 points that we just made. That if they're not following Christ, if they're not a believer, don't date them. If they're not of the opposite sex, don't date them. Like those will save you a lot of heartache.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, and a lot of times the whole like I can fix the mentality gets pushed on girls a lot because we think, oh, he's a bad boy, I can save him. But like I know guys struggle with that too. So, I only dated like really one other guy besides Brennan that I would say was like semi serious, but I definitely like approached the casual dating and there were a couple guys that were not Christians and it just and I'm so thankful that I ended those things and I realized like, "Oh, Heather, you're being quite an idiot." Because it saved me so much heartache, but how arrogant of me to think I can fix them.
Yeah,
I
I can
can make
save them.
them a believer if I just like missionary dating does not work.
No, and that's almost a God complex, because the only person that can save them is, the gospel, is Christ, is them knowing the gospel. And that's kind of getting us into unsafe territory. Do you hear about marriages that work from, a dating aspect of, oh, well, my mom was a believer and my dad became a believer after they started dating? You do hear those stories. Um, but more often than not, the statistics will tell us that those things don't work out.
Yeah. And thinking about the heartache that whichever spouses save that they had to go through in order for their spouse to eventually become a believer, like why would you want to go through that? Um, and so those are you have to start there. And so dating is very simple. Then it's like, okay, but I need more than
Yeah. So where do you
that.
go? Where do you go from there? Where can I? Let's start off. Where can I find a nice young man who loves Jesus, or a nice young woman who loves Jesus?
Well, you're probably not going to find them um, at a bar or a club partying it up. Hate to break it to you, but that's
Spoiler alert.
probably not the place you should be looking for, or on apps like Tinder that are basically set up for, the casual dating we mentioned earlier,
Yeah, yeah.
the
That
very casual dating.
Those places are not going to be the places that you are going to find like-minded believers. If you're looking in those places, maybe you need a heart check. Maybe you need to hear this, that maybe you need to check your relationship with God, because if you're looking for those um, relationships in those places, then we may have a bigger issue at hand. Yeah, that whole thing reminds me of Israel whenever they wanted a king and they were looking in the wrong places, and God's like, yeah, you can anoint Saul, but he's not the king of my choice, type thing. And just that principle of honoring God with everything we do. If we're looking in those places for a godly marriage, then we're probably not honoring God. So where should we look? Well, a good place is the church. Whether they have singles at your church, or you're looking at other local churches or other churches in other places, that's a good place to look. Um,
Yeah.
but why is that a good place?
Well, first of all, it's showing that you're both like-minded, more than not. You're also surrounded by a community of
Mm,
believers, and they're going to help keep you accountable as well as help refer you to people and stuff.
yeah,
They're people care about you, and so they're going to be like, hey, there's this person, I think you should meet them, they're great, I think y'all get along. Or they'd be like, hey, you should probably stay away from them.
yeah.
um
That's literally what happened to us. Like, uh,
yeah.
shout out Dustin, if he ever listens to this. Like, he's the
Yes.
one that kind of referred us in a way that God was already pushing us towards. And it was a really cool story that maybe we'll share on another podcast. But um, both of us were serving. And I think that's the key. Like, you can go to a church and find, a cute young boy or a cute young girl, and they can just be sitting there like a bump on the log.
Yeah.
That's it's probably not. Maybe the place that I would look, I would serve in that local church and see who's serving around me, who's like
Yes.
minded. Because Heather and I were both serving in the kids ministry, and so we both had a heart for the next generation of young believers, and that caught my attention, um, as well as her coming in to worship late. But like I said, that's another story. But I think that's a good place to start. And one thing that you brought up, Heather, is the community aspect. Um, I kind of want to dig a little deeper into that, as far as maybe you're dating somebody at who doesn't go to your church, but they go to another church. I would just give you this advice: go to that church and ask people about that person. And so if you go to the church and you say, "Hey, um, can you tell me a little bit about Joe?" and they're like, "Who is Joe?" then that's a red flag. Like
Yes.
that means that person is not in a covenantal community. Like,
Yes. And I also think seeing, okay, what is their church like? What do they believe? What is their community like? Will help you better understand what their beliefs are,
mhm.
because we surround ourselves with like minded people. And so if they're surrounding themselves with people who don't agree with what you consider to be very important biblical theological points, then it's probably not going to work out. Um, and so that's another aspect when it comes to community. Um, Another thing with dating, kind of switch gears a little bit. So it's really important to understand that when you're dating someone, there needs to be boundaries. But before we talk about boundaries, I think something to understand is that when you're dating someone, it's more so about clarity rather than intimacy. And I think this will help when it comes to boundaries if we
Mhm.
understand this point first. So, what do we mean by looking for clarity more so than intimacy?
Um, I think through clarity, we get a glimpse of intimacy. Um, I think one of the fears of, and it's the most irrational fear of, of young people dating is, well, how do I know they're a good kisser? Or like, how do I know I can be intimate? Look, let me just tell you, you can. And we can kind of leave it at that. But like those are things that you can learn later. Like that's not what's important. What's important is making sure that you're on the right page, kind of like what we're talking about with community, that you are um, clarifying your beliefs, you're clarifying your goals in life, you're clarifying where you feel like God is leading you to. So that way there's not a mix up, whenever you're maybe engaged. Like, hey, I have this cool job opportunity in Wyoming. And your fiance is like, well, we never really talked about us moving from this place. Like, I wanted to settle here. And so there's that clarity of the future, um, that I think will save you some heartache if you move and moving forward in that relationship. Because if you're not on that same page, then maybe that relationship isn't right for you.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that, like in the beginning of the relationship, there's, you don't have to know right away, like, okay, how many kids do you want? How much money do you want to make? Like, or not how much money you want to make, but like, what are your financial values? Like, you don't have to go in like hitting them hard with all those questions. I think that that comes with a little bit of time, but if you're just immediately jumping into like physical intimacy or emotional intimacy, finding clarity is not going to be easy because
No,
your
because
judgment is clouded.
yes, so much so.
Like the more you touch, the more you kiss, the more you do
Yeah.
physical things, the less clarity you're going to have because your judgment's going to be clouded. It's going to be very emotional. You're going to be super attached to them because intimacy, a lot of the intimacy we experience in marriage is for marriage. It is not for dating. And so when you add that into dating, it really clouds your judgment and
On the
it really
important
makes stuff
things.
messy.
Yeah.
Or it has the potential to make stuff messy. And so if you're looking at clarity and looking at, okay, what's your stance on kids? What's your stance on um, being a believer, the church, theology?
Yeah. On, okay, are both of us going to work, or we have kids? Like, is the wife going to stay home? Like, these are conversations um, that will bring um, peace to a relationship. And like you were saying with intimacy, like those things cloud. Hormones are good, but when you're having these conversations, you're like, oh well, that's not that bad. I can deal with that because you have that I don't know how to even explain it. You have like you feel like because you've done certain things or because you're intimate with them, like I can just oversee that.
Yeah.
And
But 5 years down the road,
yeah,
when you think more clearly, you realize, wow, this is actually a deal breaker for
yeah,
me.
yeah. And that's probably a big reason why we see even in the Christian families that we see divorce is because intimacy is a big part of our culture. The sexual things that we see on TV, that our commercials are filled with, that our music is filled with, that is just deep inside of our brains. And that's why we have to be renewed by the Spirit of God and to clear those things up and to not be participating in those things so that way we can make a sound judgment on that.
Yeah.
And with boundaries, that kind of leads into boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and saying, okay, this is too much. And I think the biggest question that I receive as a youth pastor is how far is too far? And I like what the Desiring God um, article said. If you're asking that question, then you're probably headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Because you're going to push that boundary, push that boundary, push that boundary. Are you honoring God in your relationship? Are you doing things that doesn't honor God? Then you should probably stop.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's pretty simple because those things will lead to guilt, which will lead to being heartbroken, which will lead to you bringing those things into other relationships if both of you don't work out together.
Yeah. And I think, just some practical things. Don't put yourself in way of temptation. So I don't want you to think that Brennan and I were perfect when it came to dating. There were definitely temptations that we faced, and we didn't always do the best job at keeping boundaries. I'm not going to go into like specifics or anything, but it was really hard. Like, it, especially when you're going to get married, it is hard.
Yeah.
But we did say no, and we did say we are not crossing these lines.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always tried to make sure that we didn't cross those lines. But there were times where it was like, okay, we're kind of getting a little too close for comfort. And so that's when we had to communicate with each other and say, okay, this is a boundary that we have set. We need to do a better job. And being honest in that. And so I think that's a huge thing. Don't put yourself in places of temptation. If that's being alone in a room, that is probably, and you can't handle that, then be honest with yourself. Be honest with your significant other. I think nothing good happens after midnight.
No,
I know that's a
no.
silly adult saying, but I really don't think anything good happens after midnight. Your guard is down. You are not in the right state of mind. Just you shouldn't be hanging out till 4 o'clock in the morning having these deep hours upon hours long conversations.
Yeah,
that's an emotional thing too.
Yeah, and I guess I never realized that when I was dating. Like, it's good to have deep conversation, but when you're when you're in that, the length of those conversations matter because you can be like, man, I'm falling in love with this girl even more, and like that leads to more and more intimacy that you're ready for. Like, you're not ready for that because there's no commitment. There is to a degree, but there's not a commitment like there is in a marriage.
Yeah.
And that kind of covenant relationship. I think some other practical guidelines are date within community. Go on dates with your friends. Go to public places. Go hang out at the coffee shops like we did. Hang out by serving at your church. Hang out in your connect group or your small group. Like, don't don't put yourself in a situation where you know you're going to fail.
Right. Yeah. And I think with talking about the emotional aspect, like talking about ours, um, we did say clarity over intimacy. Like there are things, within values, within marriage biblical principles that you need to have addressed. But sitting with them and spending so much time talking about marriage and what are our kids going to look like and like what are we going to do when we've been married for 10 years, like those are conversations you should just not be having all the time.
Yeah, you don't want to put the horse before the carriage type of thing.
Yes.
Like you get in this mindset of, well, oh, we're basically married. Like,
yes.
There's no basically.
That's one of my pet peeves on when I see on social media where they're like, oh, my hubby, and you're not married.
Nope.
Like, stop acting like you're married. Like, you as a woman do not need to be submitting to your boyfriend as a husband.
No.
And men, you are not to be leading her like you are her husband.
Yeah, it's good to show characteristics of those things. Like to say, oh, I am a leader. I have the potential to lead, or I have the potential to be submissive to authority type thing, but you don't need to do that in your relationship to see that. You can see that in other aspects of, all right, so my girlfriend works and she can be submissive to her boss type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Or my boyfriend, he leads Bible study with a group of guys or within a small group.
The way he treats women is good. Those are signs you can see.
And so I kind of want to move into maybe some questions that listeners may have on dating. And the first one is, I think the one that I get the most because I work with youth, but how old should I be when I start dating?
So here's the thing. If you are in high school, personally, I don't think high schoolers should date because the question I always ask, and I used to teach high school kids and I would have conversations with them about this. And I remember one girl was like, well, I like this guy, so I'm going to date him. And I said, and we were talking about dating, and I said, well, are you ready to be married? Are you ready to be a mom? Are you ready to submit to a husband? And she's like, no. I said, then why are you dating?
Yeah, it's become a recreational thing rather than let's be intentional and we're going to get married.
Yeah, and that's where you get the casual dating or the prolonged dating, and those have issues in and of itself. I knew so many people in college that dated for years in high school, and then they broke up in college, and it was so much heartache that they had to deal with because you're such a different person in high school. You're very immature. You don't know what you want. So when you get to college and you finally start figuring it out, you realize like this person is not who I want to be with. No. And so I think that brings about that prolonged dating issue, which brings about a whole lot of other things with intimacy and physical boundaries being crossed. But, I think as a woman, we're not going to sit here and be like, you have to be exactly this age. But I think a good standing principle is, okay, like, where are you at financially? Where are you at spiritually, maturity wise? Like, looking at yourself, like, okay, if I start dating someone in a few months or a year and a half,
will I be ready for marriage?
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to kind of think about. Like,
I would say I agree with that. I guess the question that I would ask myself is, in a year, would I be ready for marriage? And if my answer is no, then just be friends. That's okay. Yeah. Like, watch them, hang out with them. You don't have to date. You can still be on the lookout without dating, but your intentions need to be made known and say, I'm not ready to date, but I would like to get to know you a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe my intentions would change, and being open with that. And I think it takes the pressure off of you and the other person. And one thing that I see is older people I say older, mid-20s, that feel the pressure to need to get married because people younger than them have either been dating for a long time or they're getting married. And to them, I would say, keep looking, like keep serving. Someone is going to run, y'all are going to cross paths, and it's going to be okay. Like
Yeah.
there's no rush to pick your life partner. There's a blessing in finding someone who loves Jesus as much as you do and wants to serve him and wants to be in a godly marriage. Don't settle just because you've reached 25. Like that's dangerous.
Yeah. So the next thing is, how long should you date for?
All right, I'll answer this. How long should you not date for? If you're going on 3 years and you don't have a ring on your finger, get out. Unless there's extenuating circumstances, and I mean extenuating. Like there's got to be a barrier, and then you have to talk about that barrier. For example, let's say um, you're in med school or something like that, and you just don't have the time to dedicate to marriage. Well, then maybe you guys shouldn't be dating at that particular moment. Maybe you should wait to start dating, because I feel like the longer you date, number one, the more temptation is there, and the second, you settle. You settle on your boundaries, and you cave in on your ideals, and that's dangerous. Um, but I think our culture has said that's okay. Date for 10 plus years, just move in together. And it's like, no, that's not what God intended. Like there's an intimacy in marriage. And when you go on for 5, 6, 7 years, like, there's some kind of commitment issue there that
Mhm.
they don't want to commit to you for a lifetime. And so that's something that I would definitely, that's a red flag there. Um,
Yes, I completely agree with that. So I think our last question is, what are some red flags? You just mentioned one, like prolonged dating, just dating for years upon years and getting hung up on commitment. I think that's a huge red flag.
yeah.
Um,
There's one that shouldn't even be a red flag because it should be just a straight up no. If he's not a Christian, don't date him
yeah.
or don't date her. That's you're asking for trouble. Paul tells us to not be unequally yoked, and there's nothing good that comes from those relationships. Um, but another red flag would be how does he spend his money financially? Is he $150,000 in debt? Why is he in debt? Is it credit card debt or is it student loans? And does he have a house? Is it a mortgage debt? And so these questions are things that
Does
need
he
to be
still
answered.
live at home,
Yeah.
or she?
Why?
And you're 35.
Yeah. Um, does he have any ambitions or goals in life? Um, if he doesn't, bye Felicia. If she doesn't, bye Felicia. Like there's things that are red flags that will save you a lot of heartache early on. And you
Mhm.
can find those things early. Second or third date, you should know most of these things.
Yeah.
And if you question and there's like an aggressive type of barrier that comes up from asking those questions, then bye. Like there's no loss in that.
Mhm.
But I think another red flag, as far as just like dumping people like that, is you're not going to find a perfect person.
Exactly.
The older you are, the more hangups you probably will have. And so that's a question we kind of skipped over. But what if they do have hangups in a relationship? Those things need to be talked about and talked about early. I don't want to hear, oh, we've been dating it for a year and I just told my girlfriend that, I've had sex with 150 other partners. Like, wow, that was a big number.
That was really
I
dramatic.
didn't mean it to be that big. But if you're waiting that long and you think you're going to marry that person, that can be devastating.
Yeah, or you wait until marriage.
Oh man, I couldn't even imagine. And I think that was one thing about the beauty of Heather and I's relationship was we were up front with each other. And were those conversations hard about some of the hangups that we had? Absolutely. But it was so beneficial to know, okay, so this is what you struggle with, this is what you've been through. Like your childhood, okay, so this is in the future maybe some of the things that you'll struggle with. Like those were very beneficial to me in knowing how to eventually how to lead Heather and how to encourage her.
Yeah,
Um,
I completely agree. And there was one relationship I was in before Brennan that um there were questions that I asked about that would be a red flag for me that I was lied to about, and then eventually I found them out. And
yeah,
so I immediately was like, okay, these are deal breakers for me. And that's huge. And so it's like if you're talking to someone and you're like, okay, I'm going to ask these questions, see if red flags come up, and you find out like within a few months that they lied, then
bye.
don't even like try to fix it, because if they're willing to lie about them, like they're will that the issues you have in dating go into your marriage and
They're
they're
amplified.
only amplified.
Hmm.
And so if and I know there's some red flags, they're going to be different for some people, but
Yeah,
there's just some things that it's like, okay, this is just a deal breaker,
yeah,
point blank period. Like, with like, okay, you still struggle with like pornography, like you're watching it on the daily. That's a huge red flag
yeah,
that needs to be addressed before they're ready for a relationship. Or they're still not over a past relationship, or they are dealing with some type of addiction currently
yeah.
that very early on.
If
That's a
they're
red
known as a
flag.
local druggie, you probably shouldn't date them.
Yeah.
And
And
if I like how you said, if you're lied about these red flags, if your questions about your red flags all come back too perfect, you're probably being lied to.
yeah,
Like, there's no perfect person. If that person doesn't have a hang up, doesn't have a past, then why aren't they married already?
yeah.
Like,
And we're not saying you have to like go through all the gory details on your first, second, or third date.
no, 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 no.
But, being like, hey, this is something I've struggled with. Like, I'm not really ready to go into all of the details about this yet, but like, just know this is something that I'm working through, that God has revealed to me, and I want to push through this. And that's a good answer. And that's okay. You can be okay with that answer.
Well, that you can be okay with that because that helps you set up boundaries for your relationship. So if I
Exactly.
knew that if either one of us were struggling with like sexual desire, then I know, hey, I probably shouldn't do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And so those are good things to have because it sets you up for that relationship. If you're not willing to go through that with them, then that's okay.
Yeah.
But you're gonna have to go through those things eventually with someone.
Hmm.
And if you have one that's just a yellow flag that you can work through, be committed.
Yeah.
Go through those things.
And don't feel like, okay, a red flag came up maybe a little bit further down the line. You are not married to that person.
Nope.
If you feel like this is something I need to walk away from, then you need to walk away from it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, you don't feel like, and that's what we want to talk about with, the prolonged dating and or talking about clarity or the intimacy, is like, that's why it's important to have these conversations early, because if you're having them like 2 years in your relationship and you're like, this is a red flag, it's a deal breaker, guess what? You just wasted 2 years.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so I think that is it for what we want to talk about today. Obviously, there's so much more that we could address with
Yeah.
dating.
And if you want your question to be answered, if we didn't talk about it, please message us on Instagram. That's the best way to get in contact with us. And we would love to answer your questions. Maybe we could, if we get enough questions, we can do a little Instagram live video and go through that with you guys. But be looking out for this podcast. And then our next podcast is on marriage. So
Marriage.
we're going through the line: singleness, dating, and marriage. And all these have to do with relationships. And so even after marriage, we'll have a couple of more about, our relationship with God, our relationship with others, our relationship with non-believers. Relationships is a big part of the Christian walk. And so we want you guys to be prepared for that. But we enjoy doing this, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast. We'll catch you later.
Bye, guys.
Bye.